What? Gosh. Hi. Well, my name is Hayden. I'm the guy he said he was going to be speaking in the video. My name is Hayden Davison. I am the Student Ministry Community Director here at Green Bay Community Church, and I told this joke last time. I'm going to tell it again. That means I'm the number 2 youth guy. That's what that title means. So last week, Bobby Coverston spoke. There he is. Give him a round of applause, Bobby. Woo. Right on cue, just like we planned it. All right, Bobby spoke, and he was our part 1 of this part 2. He talked about connecting to others and talking, and the 3 different I'm all over the board right now. Woo. The different conversations that are happening when you're having a conversation, the one in your head, the one in the other person's head, and the conversation that's actually happening, right? He framed that around Simon and Jesus and the woman who washed Jesus' feet. If you missed it, I recommend you go back. It was a great sermon. But today, I want to talk to you. I'm going to continue talking about what it means to be connected to others the same way any logical, sane person would, and that is a story about jogging. Tough crowd. All right. So the story I want to share, it was in the news, I think a month ago. It's about a man named Travis Kaufman. He was going for a jog in Colorado. He's an Alabama native, but he was in Colorado, and he was like, I'm going to just go out and enjoy nature, and I'm going to go for a nice long run this morning. And he goes for a long run, and he's going through some mountainous territory, and all of a sudden he hears something behind him. No sound? There was a roar effect there. Go back. Let's try it again. And he hears something behind him. There we go. Crossroads, I'm sorry if your speakers weren't ready for that. Oops. So he hears this behind him, and so he turns and looks, and there's a mountain lion. And so he does what you're trained to do in this situation. They tell you to get real big and puff out and to scare the lion off, right? Well, it doesn't work. So now he's got to fight it. 10 yards, the mountain lion's coming. He's still trying. He's still yelling. It doesn't back down. 5 yards, lion's still coming. Lion pounces, and all of a sudden, Travis finds himself in a fight for his life in hand-to-hand combat, hand-to-paw combat with a mountain lion. He says, as he tells the story in the interview I read, that he spent most of the time trying to protect his neck and face in the encounter, and eventually ended up with the lion biting him on the arm. And he tries to throw the lion off, which just sends them both tumbling down into a ravine. In the ravine, he manages to wrestle his way on top of the lion, and he gets his knee down on the lion's throat and works his foot up and pushes and pushes and pushes down on the lion's neck until the lion finally dies. Now, Travis is all hopped up on adrenaline, doesn't realize he's bleeding, and starts running towards civilization, terrifying every single person he finds on the way because he's bleeding from everywhere because he just fought a mountain lion. In these types of situations, in these life or death situations, our brains, there we go, do what we say, it kicks in your fight or flight response. Certain parts of your brain engage that either say, all right, let's do this, or I got to get out of here. And with a mountain lion, there's no way on a mountain lion's turf you're going to outrun a mountain lion, right? So it's fight. It might be the same response, say, if someone were to stand up on stage and wield a sword around randomly like this, the same kind of like response that flares up in your brain, this nervousness, this tension about what's the sword for. My friends, my worry today is that in a metaphorical way, that this is what a lot of people expect to see when they come into a church. They expect to see someone up on stage wielding a sword, stabbing and jabbing at them, causing harm. They expect to come in and encounter a weapon, something aggressive. See, what happens in communication is your brain triggers the same way it does when you're faced with a mountain lion or a sword. When you're talking to someone and you are faced with a new idea or aggressive verbalization, your brain undergoes the same chemical changes as it does when faced with bodily harm. Your fight or flight kicks in and your brain tries to defend itself. Your personality fights to survive. So I grew up in the church. My dad is a pastor. He's here in the front row. Hi, Dad. Everybody wave. And with that comes, I experienced a little bit of this, right? I remember as a kid being worried to play with my Pokemon cards or talk about Harry Potter in church for fear some stranger I'd never met would come out of the woodwork and yell that I was going to hell for it, or the devil was inside those things. I remember I had a high school teacher make fun of me in front of the class because I didn't know a Bible trivia question. There's always this kind of unspoken rule as a pastor's kid that you have to be holier than or better than normal children because your dad is the pastor. Nobody asks an engineer's kid, right, if they can build a skyscraper. Gosh, my dad went to 4 years of college to do this. So, I was a high school kid. I remember once my family had to make a tough decision regarding the church, and instead of somebody approaching my family and talking about it, they wrote a letter to the editor in the paper, trash-talking us in the local paper, stabbing, poking, prodding. I've felt this pain from the church, as I'm sure many of you have as well. There's Proverbs 12:8 says this: the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. I think we sometimes, all of us, myself included, as a church, have a tendency to wield our words recklessly like a sword, and pierce and stab and wound instead of speaking in wisdom and bringing healing. Now, this specific sword was a gift my parents gave me on my wedding day, actually. So this is my sword. It is a basket-hilted broadsword. My understanding is that it's pretty accurate to what would have been like the 1800s in Scotland, which is kind of where my ancestry is from. So that's the fun story about the sword. But I think we have a tendency to speak recklessly instead of with wisdom to bring healing. And I'm going to come back to that later. There's a country singer, folk singer, country singer. I heard some people call him outlaw country, which sounds like a bumper sticker, right? And then there's, I found him on a playlist on Spotify that referred to him as Southern Gothic, which I'm pretty sure is an architectural style, not a style of music. But he writes this song. His name is Coulter Wall. And as I was prepping this message, this section of this song kept ringing in my mind. It's from the song Me and Big Dave. And it reads, there's some folks around town that might cuss our names down to the floor. That might claim that we're loners, no account stoners, and more. It's the same kind of people that claim to be chosen, their ears made of stone and their tongues made of poison. The doctrine they preach has got nothing that they can teach me. Now, whether the other parts of this song are totally autobiographical or just fictitious for the character he's writing as, you don't write this if you haven't felt the sword, the poking, and the prodding and the hurt from the church. Here's a man who has turned away, maybe not even turned away, but is no longer cares about the doctrine, the salvation, the freedom that can come from Jesus Christ because the church body pushed him away. When I was a student at UW Green Bay, 5 years victory lap, right? I remember leaving my dorm room, and this happened a couple of times while I was there. And I'd hear the of a megaphone turning on, that awful screechy noise. And I knew what was coming, and I would walk down the path, and slowly I'd start to hear the muffled through the megaphone of somebody speaking. And you'd get closer, and you'd get closer, and you could hear more, and you could hear more. And eventually you'd see a man standing on a literal soapbox, holding a megaphone, yelling at people, telling them they were going to hell for wearing their Packers jerseys that Monday or whatever. You worship the God of Lambeau Field and not, all this stuff. You're going to hell because of that jersey. Now, the point he was trying to make, I think, was that we as Christians sometimes elevate things above God that we shouldn't. But that's not how anybody heard it. And most of his audience probably wasn't a Christian. So, of course, there's going to be more things on their mind, like different things on their mind besides God, because they don't necessarily believe there is a God, right? So this is pointless yelling. This is aggression. And my brain did it. It read the sword in his hand and responded with a sword and like. My fight or flight kicked in, and so did every other student on campus. Their fight or flight kicked in, and people would begin to stand and protest, and all it became was two groups of people hurling insults at each other. There was no communication being done that day. Nobody drew closer to God. Nobody drew closer to each other. Everyone walked away going, yeah, I showed that guy. There's no victory. There's no movement in that. I think we sometimes, as the church, have misidentified the enemy. Ephesians says this, Ephesians 6:12, getting ahead of myself there. Ephesians 6:12 says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Mankind was made in the image of God. The image of God is not our enemy. I'm not your enemy, you're not mine. The person sitting next to you, we are not engaged with war with each other. There is a battle going on, but it's not between us. It's not between the people outside those doors. It's between Satan and his forces. We, on the other hand, we are called to listen. We are called to fight our natural tendency when faced with aggression or something outside of our normal realm of conversation, to put down our metaphorical swords and listen, to try to fight against our fight or flight response, the very nature of our brain, and respond differently. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a minister in Germany during the Second World War. He fled the country and preached in London for a series of years, but felt so compelled to go back to Germany and preach there that he returned and was eventually executed because of his anti-Nazi party views. Now, the church in World War II in Germany, there is a lot of failure there on behalf of the church. But Bonhoeffer's ministry is not one of them. Bonhoeffer writes this: the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them, just as the love of God begins with listening to his word. So the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. It is God's love for us that he not only gives us his word, but also lends us his ear. So it is his work that we do for our brothers when we learn to listen to him. Christians, especially ministers, so often think that they must always contribute something when they are in the company of others, that this is the one service that they have to render. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. Many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They will not find it among Christians because these Christians are talking when they should be listening. Bonhoeffer is talking about the same kind of behavior that Coulter Wall was talking about in his song. He's talking about that poking, that prodding of the sword, that hurt, that damage that comes when we speak recklessly. James 1:19 says, "My dear brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." Quick to hear is the rebuttal to fast to speak and fast to anger. Because when you approach somebody fast to speak, or I approach somebody fast to speak, which I do at times, or fast to anger, swords get drawn. Your fight or flight kicks in, and you're defending and you're fighting. You're not communicating. But when you listen, when you are quick to speak, defenses get drawn down. And people finally can connect and communicate. Ooh, there we go. Man, I'm all over the board with this. There we go. All right. There's a similar correlation as I talked about with the sword and with words that trigger your fight or flight response. There's a similar correlation between a hug and being heard. People say that they feel the most loved when they feel like they've been heard. They can process their emotions and bring their guard down and be in the moment and connect and draw closer to people. Stress is released. We had somebody come from Tin Man Ministries, and he talked to us, and he said that there's a physiological change that happens in your body after you've been hugged for 30 seconds. Things start to change. Your body starts to release stress. You relax. You're calm. You can process what's going on. There's almost a trope in film or media, and I'm sure you've all seen some version of this. The person is just livid. They're so upset. They're angry, and they're crying, and they're throwing things, and they just can't control themselves at all. And then somebody comes across the room and puts them into a huge embrace, hugs them, and they continue to fight and pound and beat on the back of that person until finally their shoulders slump down and they begin to sob. They release the stress and the pain and the pressure, and can finally process and be in that moment, and healing can begin. The tongue of the wise relies largely on listening. I have a friend who is universally in my friend group considered the best listener among us. And it's not because he just sits stoic and stares at us. It's because he's very intentional when he speaks. It's because you know he's been paying attention and he's trying to find out more about you and dive into more about your story and what's going on in your life. And he makes you feel loved when you're talking to him. There's a strong correlation between the same things that happen when you get hugged as when you feel that you've been heard. It tears down that fight or flight response. It helps you put down your sword and actually connect with people. Matthew 10:16 says, "I am sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves." Jesus says that the world's going to be hard, and it's going to try to chew us up and spit us out. It's going to come at us like wolves. But it does not say to respond as wolves in kind. It says to respond as the dove. We're not to draw our swords against each other. We're supposed to respond arms open, ready for a hug. So as the band comes up and I send you off today, I want you to be thinking about how you're engaging people. Are you engaging people with a sword or with a hug? Now, I have a worry today that a lot of you saw me put down my physical sword, but still feel like I haven't put down my metaphorical sword, that I'm poking and prodding at you today. But I want you to understand that My hope is that through my own baggage and my clouded filter, that you can recognize this as a hug. And that you would embrace me with a hug in return. Because I know I am guilty of coming at people with this sword. And there are relationships and situations that I have to amend for because I didn't greet them with a hug. And this takes time and practice and effort because your natural defense, your natural response is going to be to raise that sword. So as we go to the crosses this morning, my hope is that you will dwell on the conversations, the people in your lives that you've been holding the sword to and you need to embrace them with a hug. Lord Father in heaven, I just want to thank you that you embraced us with the hug and not the sword. Lord, I pray for the grace that comes when we don't do this right, that you have a grace enough for all of us, and that we have second chances. We love you and we praise your name. Amen.